SteelMindSoftHeart, the Stoic balance. Imagine this. You're standing on the deck of a ship, the sky above you churning with dark, angry clouds. The wind howls, whipping your hair into your face, and the waves crash against the hull, rocking the whole vessel like it's a toy in a bathtub. You can feel the panic rising in your chest, your heart's pounding. Your hands are sweaty and your mind's racing with a million what-ifs. What if the ship sinks? What if you don't make it home? What if this is the end? It's chaos out there, and it's starting to feel like chaos in here too, inside you. Now let me ask you something. What if I told you that even in the middle of that storm, you could find calm? Not just a fake I'm fine kind of calm, but a real deep down peace that doesn't budge no matter how hard the wind blows. Sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what Stoicism, the ancient philosophy we're diving into today, promises. It's about building a mind as strong as steel, one that can take a beating and still stand tall while keeping a heart soft enough to care, to connect, and to feel. That's the Stoic balance, and it's what we're exploring in this story. So, grab a seat because we're about to meet someone who's about to learn this the hard way. And maybe, just maybe, you'll see a little of yourself in her too. Meet Sarah. She's 32, a single mom living in a small apartment in Chicago, juggling a demanding job as a nurse and raising her 8-year-old son, Ethan. Sarah's life isn't glamorous. It's messy, loud, and full of curveballs. Her alarm goes off at 5 a.m. every day, and from the second her feet hit the floor, it's go time. Breakfast for Ethan, packing his lunch, getting him to school, then racing to the hospital for a 12-hour shift where she's on her feet, dealing with patients, doctors, and emergencies that never seem to stop. By the time she gets home, she's exhausted, but there's still dinner to make, homework to check, and a sink full of dishes staring her down. Sarah's tough, she has to be. But lately, the cracks are starting to show. The hospital's understaffed. Her boss is on her case about overtime, and Ethan's been acting out at school. Last week, she got a call from his teacher. He pushed another kid during recess. We need to talk. Sarah hung up the phone, sank into her couch, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She didn't cry. She didn't have the energy for that, but inside she was screaming. I can't do this anymore, she thought. I'm failing at everything. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Sarah scrolled through her phone, looking for something, anything to make her feel less alone. That's when she stumbled across a quote. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. It was from some guy named Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor she vaguely remembered from high school history. She stared at the words, letting them sink in. Power over her mind. She didn't feel powerful. She felt like a punching bag for life's endless jabs. But something about that quote stuck with her, like a tiny spark in the dark. The next day was a doozy. A patient yelled at her for something she couldn't control. Her car wouldn't start after her shift. And when she finally got home, thanks to a tow truck and a $200 bill, Ethan spilled juice all over the kitchen floor she'd just mopped. Sarah snapped. Can't you be careful for once? She shouted, louder than she meant to. Ethan's eyes welled up and he ran to his room. The second the door slammed, Sarah's stomach dropped. She hadn't meant to yell. She loved that kid more than anything. But she was drowning, and she didn't know how to swim. That's when she remembered the quote. She pulled it up on her phone again, reading it over and over. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Okay, she thought, let's test this. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and tried to picture that ship in the storm. The waves were her job, her car, Ethan's tantrums, all the stuff she couldn't stop. But the ship? That was her. She couldn't control the storm, but maybe she could steer the ship. Maybe she could decide how she reacted, even when everything else was falling apart. Sarah walked to Ethan's room, knocked softly, and peeked in. He was curled up on his bed, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Hey, buddy, she said, sitting beside him. I'm sorry I yelled. I was mad, but not at you, not really. I'm just tired. Can we try again? Ethan looked up, wiped his nose, and nodded. Can we have pancakes for dinner? He asked. Sarah laughed, the tension easing out of her shoulders. Yeah, we can do that. That small moment was Sarah's first taste of stoicism in action. She didn't fix her car or her job with that one deep breath, but she took back a piece of herself. She started to see that the chaos outside didn't have to mean chaos inside. It wasn't about ignoring her feelings, her frustration, her guilt, her love for Ethan, but about choosing what to do with them. That's the steel mind part. The strength to stand firm when life hits hard. And the soft heart? That's what let her apologize, hug her son, and whip up those pancakes with a smile. Over the next few days, Sarah dug deeper. She found a beat-up copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius at a used bookstore and started reading it on her breaks. The guy was an emperor, sure, but he wrote like he got it, like he'd been through the ringer too. If it's endurable, then endure it, he said. Don't complain. Sarah thought about that at work when a doctor snapped at her for no reason. She wanted to snap back, but instead, she took a breath and let it go. It wasn't easy, but it felt freeing, like she wasn't a slave to every little thing that went wrong. She also found Seneca, another Stoic, who talked about preparing for tough times before they hit. We must make ourselves ready for the blows of fate, he wrote. Sarah started doing that in small ways. When she woke up, she'd think, okay, today might suck. The car might break down again, or Ethan might spill something. That's fine, I can handle it. It wasn't about being pessimistic, it was about being ready. And when the inevitable happened, like when Ethan dumped a bowl of cereal on the couch, she didn't lose it. She just grabbed a towel and thought, this is what I signed up for. Little by little, Sarah was building that steel mind. But the soft heart part? That was harder. She'd spent so long toughing it out that letting herself really feel scared. She didn't want to be weak. But then she read Epictetus, another Stoic big shot. What need is there to weep over parts of life? The whole of it calls for tears. It hit her like a ton of bricks. Life was messy and beautiful and hard all at once. She didn't have to pretend it wasn't. She could be strong and let herself care about Ethan, about her patience, about herself. One night, after a brutal shift, Sarah sat on her balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker. She thought about the storm she'd imagined, the one she was steering through every day. It wasn't gone. The waves were still there, crashing around her, but she wasn't sinking. She was learning to sail. And that, she realized, was the Stoic balance. A mind that could take the hits and a heart that could still love through it all. Sarah's life didn't slow down after that night on the balcony. If anything, it sped up. The hospital announced mandatory overtime to cover staff shortages. Ethan's school sent home a note about a parent-teacher conference, and the landlord left a voicemail about a rent increase. She'd started dipping her toes into stoicism, but now it felt like the universe was testing her, like it was saying, oh, you think you've got this figured out? Let's see how you handle this. 1. Morning, as she rushed to get Ethan out the door, her phone buzzed with a text from her mom. Call me when you can. It's about Dad. Sarah's stomach twisted. She hadn't spoken to her father in years, not since he walked out when she was 16, leaving her and her mom to fend for themselves. He'd been a ghost in her life, a shadow she'd tried to bury, under work and motherhood. She didn't have time for this, not today. She shoved the phone in her pocket and kept moving, but the text gnawed at her all day. Between taking vitals and dodging a patient's spilled tray, her mind kept drifting back to it. What did he want now? Why, after all this time? By the time she clocked out, she was a mess of nerves, angry, curious, and something else she couldn't name. She called her mom on the drive home, hands gripping the steering wheel. He's sick, her mom said, voice quiet. Cancer. He's asking to see you. Sarah didn't say much. She mumbled something about being busy and hung up. When she got home, Ethan was already there, dropped off by a neighbor. He was sprawled on the couch playing a game on his tablet. Hey Mom, can we order pizza? He asked, not looking up. Normally, she'd say no, money was tight, but tonight, she just nodded. Sure, bud. Whatever you want. She needed a minute to think. After Ethan was fed and tucked in, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with Meditations open in front of her. She flipped through it, looking for something to grab onto. Her eyes landed on a line. What need is there to be disturbed by anything external? The disturbance comes from your judgment about it. She read it again, slower. Was she disturbed because her dad was sick or because of what she thought it meant? She'd spent years telling herself she didn't care about him, that he didn't deserve her time. But now, with this news, all those old feelings were bubbling up like a pot she'd left on the stove too long. Sarah closed the book and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. She pictured that ship again, the one she'd imagined in the storm. This time the waves weren't just her job or Ethan's spills, they were her past, crashing in with a force she hadn't expected. Marcus Aurelius was right. She couldn't change what her dad had done or even that he was sick now. That was outside her control. But how she handled it, that was on her. The next day she called her mom back. "I'll go see him," she said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "But I'm not promising anything." Her mom sighed, relieved. "That's all he's asking for, Sarah. Just a chance." The visit was set for Saturday at a hospital an hour away. Sarah spent the week preparing not just the logistics but her mind. She'd started a little habit inspired by Seneca. Every morning, she'd sit for 5 minutes and think about what could go wrong, not to stress herself out but to get ready. He might guilt trip me, she'd think. He might act like nothing happened. I might get mad and storm out. Okay, I can deal with that. It was like mental armor, and it made her feel less like a victim of whatever was coming. When Saturday rolled around, Sarah dropped Ethan off at a friend's house and drove to the hospital. Her dad was in a small room on the 3rd floor, hooked up to machines that beeped softly. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, grayer, his face lined with years she hadn't witnessed. "Sarah," he said when she walked in, his voice raspy. "You came." She nodded, staying near the door. "Yeah, I'm here." She didn't know what else to say. Part of her wanted to yell, to unload every hurt she'd carried since he left. Another part wanted to turn around and leave, but she thought of Epictetus. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. She took a breath and sat down. They talked, or rather, he did. He told her about the cancer, how it started in his lungs and spread fast. He apologized, sort of mumbled words about being a lousy father, about wishing he'd done things differently. Sarah listened, her steel mind kicking in. She didn't let his words pull her under. She didn't argue or cry. She just took it in like she was observing a storm from the shore instead of drowning in it. But then he said something that cracked her armor. "I kept a picture of you," he said, pointing to a faded photo on the bedside table, her at 10, gap-toothed and grinning on a swing. "It's the only thing I took when I left." Sarah's throat tightened. She hadn't expected that. The soft heart she'd been guarding started to Asianot for him. Exactly. But for the kid in that picture who didn't know what was coming. She didn't stay long. "I've got to get back to Ethan," she said, standing up. He nodded, looking smaller somehow. "Thanks for coming, Sarah. I know I don't deserve it." She didn't reply, just gave a tight smile and left. The drive home was quiet, her mind spinning. She'd gone in expecting a fight or a breakdown, but what she got was complicated. She didn't forgive him, not yet. Maybe not ever, but she didn't hate him either. She'd faced the wave and stayed upright. That was enough for now. Back home, she pulled out Meditations again. Marcus had a line that fit. "The art of living is more like wrestling than dancing." Sarah laughed to herself. Yeah, that tracked. Life wasn't a graceful twirl, it was a grapple, a constant push and pull. But she was learning the moves. She'd wrestled with her past that day, and she hadn't lost. Over the next few weeks, Sarah kept building that stoic balance. At work, when a patient's family chewed her out over a delayed test result, she didn't take it personally. She couldn't control the lab's schedule. With Ethan, when he forgot his homework again, she didn't yell. She sat him down and worked through it with him. Her mind was getting tougher, more resilient, but her heart stayed open. She hugged Ethan a little tighter, listened to her patients a little longer, even called her mom to check in. One night, as she flipped through Seneca, she found a gem. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. That hit hard. She'd spent years imagining her dad as this monster, this wound that wouldn't heal. But seeing him real, frail, human shifted something. The reality wasn't as bad as the story she'd built in her head. It didn't erase the pain, but it made it lighter. Sarah was starting to get it. Stoicism wasn't about shutting down or toughing it out alone. It was about facing life head-on storms, pasts, all of it with a mind that could bend but not break, and a heart that could feel without falling apart. She wasn't perfect at it. Some days she still snapped or spiraled, but she was steering that ship, and the waters, wild as they were, didn't scare her as much anymore. Sarah was starting to feel like she had a handle on this stoicism thing. Not that life was easy, it wasn't, but she'd found a rhythm. She'd wake up, brace herself for the day's chaos with a quick mental rundown of what could go wrong, and then tackle it with a mix of grit and grace. Work was still a grind. Ethan still had his moments, and her dad's shadow lingered in the back of her mind, but she was managing. The ship was steady, even if the waves kept coming. Then came the day that almost capsized her. It started like any other Tuesday. Sarah was at the hospital halfway through her shift when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. Policy said no phones on the floor, but it buzzed again and again. On the fourth buzz, she ducked into the break room, heart pounding. It was Ethan's school. "Mrs. Carter? You need to come now. Ethan's been in a fight. He's hurt and we've had to call an ambulance." The world tilted. Sarah didn't hear much after that, just ambulance, and now. She told her supervisor, grabbed her keys and ran to her car, her mind a blur of fear and guilt. A fight? Ethan wasn't a fighter. He was goofy, sensitive, the kid who'd rather draw dinosaurs than throw punches. What happened? Was he okay? She drove to the ER, hands shaking on the wheel, every red light feeling like a personal attack. When she got there, Ethan was in a curtained-off bed, his lip swollen and a nasty bruise blooming across his cheek. A nurse was checking his vitals while a school counselor hovered nearby. "He's okay," the nurse said, seeing Sarah's wild eyes. "Just banged up. No concussion, no broken bones." Sarah sank into a chair beside him, relief crashing over her like a wave, but it didn't last. "What happened?" she asked, brushing Ethan's hair back. He wouldn't look at her, just stared at his hands. The counselor stepped in. Two older boys were picking on him at recess. He pushed one and it turned into a scuffle. He's suspended for 3 days. Sarah's stomach dropped. Suspended? Her sweet, quiet kid? She wanted to argue, to demand the whole story, but Ethan finally spoke. "They said I was a loser 'cause I don't have a dad," he mumbled. "I told them to stop, but they wouldn't, so I hit one." Sarah's heart broke. She pulled him into a hug, careful of his bruises, and felt him tremble against her. "You're not a loser," she whispered. "You're the best thing I've got." But inside she was reeling. This wasn't just a playground scrap, it was her past reaching out to hurt her kid. Her dad's absence, her struggles, all the stuff she'd tried to shield Ethan from, it was spilling over anyway. The rest of the day was a blur. She took Ethan home, set him up on the couch with ice packs and his favorite movie, and called the school to sort out the suspension. The principal was sympathetic, but firm. "Zero tolerance policy. He'll be back Monday." Sarah hung up, frustration boiling. It wasn't fair. Ethan wasn't the bad guy here. She wanted to scream, to march down there and fight for him, but she couldn't. She was stuck. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Sarah sat on the floor of her living room, meditations in her lap. She needed something, anything to keep her from falling apart. She flipped to a page she'd marked. "If you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your own judgment about it. And it is in your power to wipe out that judgment now." She stared at the words, trying to make them stick. Was she mad at the school? Or at herself? At those boys or at the life she couldn't give Ethan? She closed her eyes and pictured the ship. The storm was raging, no huge, dark waves of guilt and anger crashing over the deck. She'd been sailing pretty well lately. But this felt like a hurricane. She couldn't control the bullies or the school's rules or her dad's choices years ago. But she could control how she steered through it. She took a shaky breath and whispered to herself, "Okay, Marcus. Let's see if this works." The next morning, Sarah woke up with a plan. She wasn't going to let this break her Ethan. She sat him down over breakfast pancakes again, because why not, and said, "We've got 3 days. Let's make them count. What do you want to do?" Ethan shrugged, still quiet, but then he said, "Can we go to the museum? The one with the dinosaur bones?" Sarah smiled. "Yeah, we can do that." She also pulled out Seneca's trick again, preparing for the worst. "People might stare at your bruise," she told herself. "Ethan might not open up right away. That's okay. I can handle it." It wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about being ready for what wasn't. And when they got to the museum, Ethan did perk up, pointing at a T-Rex skeleton and rattling off facts he'd learned from his books. Sarah watched him, her soft heart swelling. He was still her kid, bruises and all. But the real test came later that day. They were at the park, Ethan kicking a soccer ball around, when her phone rang. It was her dad. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Sarah," he said, his voice weaker than before. "I just wanted to check in. How's Ethan?" She froze. She hadn't told him about the fight, hadn't told him much of anything. "He's fine," she said, glancing at Ethan. "How'd you know to ask?" "Your mom mentioned he'd had a rough week," he said. "I've been thinking about him, about you." Sarah's steel mind kicked in, keeping her steady, but her soft heart ached. He sounded genuine, but she didn't trust it, not yet. "He's tough," she said finally. "Like me." There was a pause, then he said, "I know. I'm proud of that." She didn't know what to say, so she just hung up. That call stuck with her. She didn't want his pride, she didn't need it. But it stirred something. Later she read Epictetus. "You are not your body or your possessions, but your choices." Her dad had made his choices, and they'd shaped her life. But now, she was making hers. She chose to take Ethan to the museum instead of stewing in anger. She chose to listen to her dad without exploding. She was choosing her ship's course, not just drifting with the storm. By the end of the 3 days, Ethan was laughing again, his bruise fading. Sarah wasn't naive, school would still be rough, and her dad's illness wasn't going away. But she felt a shift. Her mind was stronger, forged in the heat of that awful week. She could take the hit, suspension, guilt, all of it, and keep standing. And her heart? It stayed soft enough to hold Ethan close, to feel the weight of her dad's words without letting them sink her. One night, as she tucked Ethan in, he looked up and said, "Thanks for the museum, Mom. It was cool." She kissed his forehead. "Anytime, bud." She walked out, turned off the light, and thought, "This is it. This is the balance. Steel to face the chaos, softness to love through it." She wasn't perfect, but she was getting there, one messy, beautiful day at a time. Sarah had weathered some rough seas lately, Ethan's fight, her dad's reappearance, the relentless grind of work, and she was still standing. She'd built a steel mind that could take the punches, and a soft heart that kept her human. It wasn't perfect. Some days she still stumbled. But she was learning to roll with it, to steer her ship through the storms instead of just hoping they'd pass. And for a while, it seemed like the waters might finally be calming. Then came the call she'd been dreading. It was a chilly Thursday evening, and she was helping Ethan with a science project, something about volcanoes, complete with baking soda and vinegar fizzing everywhere. Her phone rang, and she wiped her hands on a towel before answering. It was her mom, voice tight. "Sarah, it's your dad. He's gone past this afternoon." The room went quiet, except for the faint hiss of Ethan's volcano experiment. Sarah set the phone down, her mind blank. Gone. She'd known it was coming. Cancer doesn't mess around, but hearing it still hit like a rogue wave. Ethan looked up, confused. "Mom, you okay?" She forced a smile. "Yeah, bud, just need a minute." She stepped onto the balcony, the cold air biting her cheeks, and let the news sink in. Her dad was dead. The man who'd left, who'd hurt her, who'd tried to reach out too late, he was gone. She waited for the tears, the anger, something big to crash over her, but it didn't come. Instead, she felt still, not numb exactly, but steady. She leaned on the railing, staring at the city lights, and thought about Marcus Aurelius. Death is nothing to us, since when we are, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not. It sounded cold on paper, but right then it made sense. Her dad wasn't suffering anymore. And she? She was still here, breathing, living. Sarah went back inside, sat with Ethan, and finished the volcano project. She didn't tell him yet there'd be time for that later. For now, she just wanted to be with him, to feel the messy joy of being his mom. That was her soft heart at work, keeping her tethered. But her steel mind was there too, holding her steady so she didn't spiral into what-ifs or regrets. The funeral was a few days later, a small affair at a church she hadn't been to since she was a kid. Her mom was there, eyes red but composed, and a handful of people Sarah didn't recognize, old friends of her dad's maybe. She didn't speak, just sat in the back with Ethan, who fidgeted in his too big dress shirt. When it was over, her mom handed her a box. "He wanted you to have this," she said. Inside was that photo of her on the swing, a few letters he'd never sent, and a cheap silver bracelet she vaguely remembered wearing as a teenager. Sarah took the box home and set it on her kitchen table, staring at it like it might bite. She didn't want to open those letters, not yet. But she picked up the photo, tracing the edges. That girl, grinning and carefree, felt so far away. She'd spent years blaming her dad for stealing that version of her, for leaving her to grow up too fast, but now, she wasn't so sure. Maybe he'd shaped her, but he didn't define her. Not anymore. She pulled out Meditations that night, flipping to a line she'd underlined. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." She'd first read that months ago when she was drowning in stress. Now it felt like a lifeline. Her dad's death, his absence, the pain he'd left behind, those were outside her control. But how she carried it, that was hers. She could choose to let it crush her, or she could choose to keep going. Sarah decided to write him back, not for him, but for her. She grabbed a notebook and started scribbling. "You hurt me," she wrote. "You left, and I had to figure it out alone. But I did. I'm stronger now, stronger than you ever were. And I'm not mad anymore. I just wish you'd seen who I became." She tore the page out, folded it, and tucked it into the box with his letters. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was close enough. She felt lighter, like she'd dropped an anchor she'd been dragging for years. The next few weeks were a blur of normalcy: work, school, Ethan's chatter about dinosaurs. But Sarah noticed something. The storms didn't rattle her as much. When a patient snapped at her, she shrugged it off. When Ethan spilled paint on the carpet, she grabbed a rag and laughed. She was still tired, still stretched thin, but she wasn't breaking. Seneca had been right. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. She'd spent so long imagining the worst: her dad's rejection, Ethan's struggles, her own failures, that the real thing, when it came, was manageable. 1. Saturday, she took Ethan to the park, the same one where her dad had called her weeks before. They kicked a soccer ball around, the air crisp with early spring. Ethan ran ahead, shouting, "Bet you can't catch me!" Sarah chased him, laughing, her breath puffing in the cold. When they collapsed on the grass, panting, he looked at her and said, "You're fun, Mom." She grinned. "Good. Let's keep it that way." That night, she sat on her balcony with a cup of tea, the box from her dad beside her. She finally opened one of his letters. It was short, written in shaky handwriting. "Sarah, I messed up, I know it. I hope you're happy. You deserve it." She folded it back up, her soft heart stinging a little. He'd been flawed deeply, but he'd cared in his broken way. She didn't need to hate him for that. Epictetus popped into her head. What need is there to weep over parts of life? The whole of it calls for tears. She smiled to herself. Yeah, life was a mesher's. Her, Dad's, everyone's, but it was also beautiful. She had Ethan, her little warrior with his bruised cheek and big heart. She had her job, tough as it was, saving lives in her own small way. She had this moment right now with the city humming below her. Sarah had found the Stoic balance. Her steel mind let her face the chaos, death, guilt, the daily grind without buckling. Her soft heart kept her connected to Ethan, to her patience, even to the memory of her dad. She wasn't invincible, she still had bad days, but she'd learned to wrestle with life, not just dance around it. And that, she realized, was enough. She closed the box, took a sip of tea, and looked out at the skyline. The ship was still sailing, the storm still brewing. But she was the captain now, steady, strong, and ready for whatever came next.